Welcome to The Curious Photographer. My name is Mike Byrne, and today I'm going to talk about exposure. That is, getting the light right, exactly, in your photographs. There are two approaches to this. If you're using a phone camera or just a small point and shoot, typically all the exposure work is done for you. There's really not much playing with the photograph that you can do. But if you're shooting with a higher end camera, and you really want to get unique images and to get the light exactly right, then you're going to need to learn about all the different exposure settings in your camera. One of my favorite photography locations is the ghost town of Kolmanskop in southwestern Namibia. Working inside and outside these abandoned buildings is a ton of fun and also quite challenging. Look at this scene. I have dark corners, sandy midtones, and harsh highlights where shafts of sunlight overexpose sections of the sandy floor. My eyes have no problem taking this all in, but my camera isn't so capable. That's because my eyes have better dynamic range than my camera. Dynamic range is very important to photography. It refers to your camera's ability to capture the darkest and lightest tones in an image. Dynamic range is measured in stops of light, where one stop of light equals a doubling of the brightest level. The human eye can perceive about 20 stops of light. This allows us to see shadow details even in very bright light. Cameras do not capture as much dynamic range as the human eye. The best modern cameras can capture about 15 stops of dynamic range in any one photo. Most digital cameras capture somewhere between 12 and 14 stops. Phone cameras generally capture even less dynamic range, though the newest phone cameras use something called computational photography to improve their images. This is why, when you take photos, such as this one in Kolmanskop, you find that you have lost shadow detail, known as crushing your shadows, or bright spots are completely blown out. Even worse, sometimes you have problems at both ends of the dynamic range. Watch what happens when I view this image on my computer. This program allows me to view what are called exposure warnings. The blue areas are areas where shadow detail has been lost. The red areas are areas highlights have been blown out. Simply put, there is more dynamic range in this scene than my camera, a very capable Nikon D850, can capture. By the way, this image is captured at 64 ISO, which should give me the maximum dynamic range that the D850 can capture, a very capable 15 stops. Once you understand all the basics of exposure, you'll find there are strategies for dealing with every exposure problem. The first thing you have to understand is called the exposure triangle. Achieving the best exposure for your image is a matter of having the right settings for three different things. The first is your aperture. The wider you open your aperture, the more light will hit your image. The second item is shutter speed. The longer your shutter is open, the more light comes in to expose your image. The third element is called ISO, or ISO. This is really a way the camera adjusts its exposure in low light. So as you increase ISO, you increase your camera's ability to capture images in darker areas. Now, the thing to remember about the exposure triangle is all these three elements, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, work together to produce an exposure. If I change shutter speed, then there has to be a corresponding change in either aperture or ISO in order to achieve the same exposure. This would seem to make sense, so that I can take a picture at, say, ISO 100 and aperture setting f number 4 at 1/100th of a second, or I could increase my ISO to, say, 200, so that's a doubling of the ISO, which means one of the other settings also has to change. So if my previous shot was shot at 1/100th of a second, this shot would be at 1/200th of a second. those would give me the same exposure. I doubled my ISO, I increased my shutter speed, and that kept the exposure the same. By the same token, I could have also opened up my aperture some more. So if I increase my shutter speed from 100 to 200th of a second, that lets in half as much light because the shutter speed is 1/2. So rather than changing ISO, I need to open up my aperture. So now I want to let in twice as much light. And that would mean going from f4 down a stop to f2.8. So f2.8 is a wider aperture. It lets in more light, in fact, twice as much light as an f number for aperture of f4. Working with the exposure triangle can get tricky, and your camera has lots of options that will allow you to do this. First, fully automatic mode essentially sets those three things for you. So if you're in green mode, or if you're in P for program mode, your camera is going to create settings for aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And there's all sorts of smarts built into your camera to try to get those numbers right. But ultimately, the camera is still guessing at what your intentions are with this photograph. So you can start to take a little bit of control over the exposure triangle by saying, what really matters to me in this picture is shutter speed. There's motion in my picture, and I either want a slow shutter speed or a fast shutter speed. So to do that, you're going to put your camera into TV mode or shutter speed priority mode. And that means you can set the shutter speed, but the camera will work out your aperture for you. And if you set ISO to automatic, it will work out that for you as well. So now, looking at your moving image, you pick the shutter speed that matters most, the camera does the rest of the work. And that's a great way to go. The same sort of thing can be done with aperture. If I'm shooting a landscape and aperture really matters to me, then I can go to aperture priority mode, which is AV or A on your camera dial. Now I get to pick my aperture. So with a landscape, maybe I want to shoot with a lot of depth of field, so I'm at f13 or something like that. I can now set the camera to work out the shutter speed and the ISO, and all I have to do is dial in the one thing that matters most to me. Now, if you want to get a little fancier, you can turn ISO off, so it's no longer automatic. And now I can start picking my own ISO as well. And in this landscape example, this makes a lot of sense. If I have a tripod, I have an ideal aperture I want to shoot at. I also have an ideal ISO to shoot at. I want to be at the optimum ISO for my camera. And because I'm on a tripod, the shutter speed actually doesn't matter. If it's a 1/5 of a second or a 50th of a second or a 500th of a second, either way, if I'm on a nice stable tripod, I'm going to get the image that I want. So in this case, I might go to aperture priority mode, dial in my aperture, set my ISO to optimum for my camera, which in many cameras is ISO 100, but it does vary from manufacturer and from model to model. And I'll let the camera figure out what the shutter speed is. And honestly, I don't care if it's a second or 10 seconds or a 1/10 of a second or a 100th of a second. As long as I have that stable tripod, I'm going to get my shot. So this is an example of where I'm really starting to take control of my exposure triangle. I'm working on two of the variables and letting the camera compute the third. Finally, of course, you can also set your camera to manual exposure mode. Now this means I'm going to control all three things. So again, with this landscape, now I'm going to look at it and say, I want my aperture to f13, I want my ISO at 100, and now I'm also going to have to adjust the shutter speed so that I can figure out what is the optimum exposure for this image. So now I'm controlling all three elements. The beauty of this means you are fully in control of this image, and you are going to get exactly the results that you want to get. The tricky part of working with the exposure triangle for many beginners is aperture. Shutter speed makes sense. 1/100th of a second to a 200th of a second to a 400th of a second. Clearly, those are shorter and shorter shutter speeds. Likewise, ISO. You have ISO 100, 200 is twice as sensitive, 400 is twice as sensitive as 200, and so on. These numbers are easy to work with. But aperture is measured in F numbers, and quite a few people really struggle with them. And to be honest, there's no real easy way that I can tell you that makes it simple, other than there's a couple things you have to remember. As f numbers increase, the physical size of your aperture decreases, and the amount of light, therefore, that strikes the camera sensor decreases. So f8 lets in a lot less light than f4. f4 is a wider aperture, f8 is a smaller one. f16 is smaller again. Keep that always in mind. Higher f numbers, less light gets into your camera. So if I take f2.8 and switch to f5.6, I'm actually letting in a quarter as much light, keeping in mind that as the numbers get bigger, the aperture, the physical opening of your shutter is smaller. So 5.6 doubled is 11. So f11 lets in as a quarter as much light as f5.6. The only easy way to remember this is just to remember this sequence of numbers, and each number here represents one stop of light. So I go from f2 to f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22. Each one of those numbers represents a stop of light change from the previous number. Try to remember them. Let's take a look at an example of the exposure triangle in action. In this image, my goal was to freeze the athlete in place. My settings were 1 3200th of a second, f4, and ISO 1600. Now, in the second image, my goal was to try to blur the background while still keeping the athlete sharp. This would give a better sense of the athlete's movement. So my settings were very different. 1/50th of a second, f11, and ISO 200. Do these settings produce the same exposure? Let's check our exposure triangle. My shutter speed changed from 1/50th to 1/3200th. How many stops is that? Well, 50 doubled is 100, doubled is 200, doubled is 400, doubled is 800, 1600, and then finally 3200. That's 6 stops of light added to the image. Now let's look at the aperture. I changed from f4 to f11. How many stops is that? f11 is a smaller aperture than f4, so f4, f5.6, f8, f11. That's 3 stops of light less. f11 lets in 3 stops of light less than f4. Lastly, let's look at the ISO. My settings went from 1600 to 200. How many stops of light is that? Well, 200 doubled is 400 to 800 and then 1600. So that's also 3 stops of light less. So these exposures are exactly the same. I added 6 stops of light by decreasing my shutter speed from 1/3200th of a second to 1/50th of a second. Then I reduced my exposure by 3 stops of light by closing my aperture from f4 to f11. Finally, I reduced my exposure by a further 3 stops of light by reducing from ISO 1600 to ISO 200. Here's another example of the exposure triangle in action. This comes from Coleman's cup. In this first shot at Coleman's cup, my exposure settings are ISO 200, 1/200th of a second, and f13. Pretty typical settings for shooting outdoor landscapes. In this second shot, my exposure looks pretty much the same, but my settings are very different. ISO 1600, 1/2500th of a second, and f10. So let's do some math here to prove that the exposure is the same. First, ISO is increased from 200 to 1600. That's 200 doubled 3 times, 200, 400, 800, 1600, or 3 stops of light added to the image. Now let's look at the aperture. I opened the aperture wider, from f13 to f10. That adds another 2/3 of a stop of light to the image. Lastly, my shutter speed has changed from 1/200th of a second to 1/2500th of a second. This allowed me to capture the moving sand. This change in shutter speed subtracts 3 2/3 stops of light. Essentially, 200 doubled to 400 is 1 stop, doubled to 800 is 2 stops, doubled to 1600 is 3 stops, and then moving up to 2500 adds 2/3 more of a stop. Of course, a full stop would have taken me to 3200, or 1/3200th of a second. Most cameras include a very useful tool in helping you to judge your exposures. It's called a histogram, and if you don't see it through your viewfinder or on the LCD at the back, go through your menus and see if you can turn it on. A histogram is essentially a chart showing you all the tonal ranges in your image, from dark to light. At one end of the histogram, you will see all the dark tones, then midtones, and then highlights. A well-exposed image should not have any high peaks at either the dark end or the light end. If you look at this image, you can see that it is a little underexposed. You can see the histogram is pushed towards the dark end. Now, if I adjust the exposure setting for the image, I can change the histogram so that it is pushed more towards the light side. But, big warning, if you push too far to the light side, you will start blowing out detail. Those are those highlights that we talked about before. So be very wary of spikes right at the highlight end of the histogram. There are a couple important things to keep in mind when looking at your histogram. First of all, in an ideal world, the histogram should be right side biased. In other words, it should be bright and not dark. You just have to be very careful that it's not too bright so that you end up clipping or losing some of those highlights. But ultimately, when you look at a histogram and it shows more middle or lower side orientation, it's best to increase your exposure, allow more light into your camera to push that histogram towards the bright side. This will ensure you get nice bright colors. Another thing to keep track of is looking at a scene. Some scenes are meant to be dark, and you don't want to over brighten that, and your camera will tend to try to do that. For example, shooting sunsets, what your camera thinks is it's daylight, and it wants to expose this image as if it were noon. Clearly, that's not the right exposure. So you have to look at your histogram and say, I need it to be darker. It is dark. It's evening, the light's starting to go, the sun's almost set. And typically, when I'm shooting sunsets, I might be as much as 2 stops underexposed in order to actually get the right light, what my eyes see. So histograms are useful. Show them all the time. Check your images on the back of your screen or through your viewfinder and reshoot if necessary, getting the histogram to show what makes the most sense for that image. Another thing when you're looking at your histograms is remember this: if you are a little underexposed, it's generally going to be easier to brighten your image using computer software. You can fill some of that shadow detail on your computer. However, if your exposure is over the top, if you have overexposed any part of a picture, often there is no way to recover that. When thinking about exposure, there is another camera setting you should be aware of that has more impact than you might think, and that is capturing images as RAW or as JPEG. From a technical point of view, it would seem sensible that both would capture the same dynamic range, and you wouldn't lose any of this exposure capability by shooting JPEGs. But in practical terms, you do lose something. The compression involved in JPEG frequently shrinks the dynamic range. It means that you will have more blowouts or more lost shadow detail. But even more practically speaking, if you are in a circumstance such as I was down in Coleman's-Cop, where I have lots of brights and lots of darks, with a raw image, I have the ability to go onto my computer and edit this picture and try to pull back some of the lost detail and try to limit some of the losses from highlights. So a raw image is far more editable than a JPEG. Look at these two pictures. The first was taken by a friend of mine, and these are at Beacon Hill Park in Victoria. She was shooting on a Sony a7 II, but she was shooting JPEGs. And she captured an image, and I put my camera on a tripod more or less right beside hers. And I captured roughly the same image. And the biggest difference is I was shooting RAW. When we got back to the computer, I looked at her image, and it was significantly overexposed. So I quickly tried to adjust it, and I dropped the exposure setting by over 2 stops to take away all this brightness in the image. And I monkeyed with some of the other settings for shadows and whites and highlights and so on. What I ended up with was this muddy, ugly JPEG, and it looked terrible. Then what I did is I copied exactly those changes I made to her picture, and I went to my copy, which was also significantly overexposed, but it was a raw image. I pasted the changes I made to her image directly onto my raw image, and look what came out. This picture is completely usable, it's sharp, it's bright, it looks great. Go back, hers is muddy, JPEG. Come back again to mine, raw image, looks great. So this is one of the less obvious implications of choosing JPEG or RAW. In almost all circumstances, I recommend shoot RAW. At the heart of every camera is a light meter. This is the device that is built into your camera that allows the camera to measure the amount of light in the scene, and it's against this light meter that all your settings for aperture and shutter speed and ISO are calculated. In the old days, people, and still today in some places, people used to take handheld light meters and measure the amount of light all across a scene. They could look at this and say there's this amount of light and that results in these settings for aperture, shutter speed, and film speed, or ISO. And then they would dial that into their camera. Today the light meters are built into your camera, but they're doing effectively the same thing. And your camera gives you all sorts of different ways to, well, measure this light. Camera manufacturers have built a tremendous amount of intelligence into your camera to help you meter a scene. In doing this, they've developed different metering modes. And the primary one that you're expected to use and where they've put most of their work is called multi-metering. It's also called evaluative, pattern, or matrix metering, depending upon the camera manufacturer. But what they do is essentially the same. They look at the entire scene and they measure the light in a certain number of quadrants throughout the scene. They take all those measurements together, they evaluate them against a whole wide set of criteria and tell you this is the optimum amount of light for your picture. Now, given the exposure triangle, of course, you can always adjust aperture, shutter speed, or ISO to still sustain that exposure, but ultimately the camera is trying to tell you through its light meter that this is the right amount of light. Let's look at some of these different modes and what they do. So first is this matrix, evaluative, pattern, or multi-zone. This is kind of the all-purpose metering mode, and personally, it's the only one I use. It measures the entire scene and gives you a good approximation of what it thinks is going to be the best exposure. And they have spent a ton of time with these new cameras trying to make sure that it is roughly the right exposure. But there are circumstances where it's going to be wrong. And that's why they've come up with other systems. Another one they use is called center-weighted. Center-weighted metering basically means it's still going to measure the entire scene, but those measurements that it takes out of the center of the scene are going to be given more importance when coming up with a setting for the entire scene. This can be really useful when photographing fairly large, say, dark objects, like a big brown bear that fills a good chunk of the center of your scene. The bear is quite dark. The rest of the scene may be quite bright, and to be honest, how badly do you care about the rest of the scene? You want to get the bear right. So this is a case where center-weighted metering might be a better choice. Now let's go to a further extreme. Let's say you're at the back of a theater and you have a dance group performing on stage. You're trying to get a picture of that dancer. This is where spot metering works, because ultimately you only want the metering on the dancer's face who's spotlit. If you don't get this metering right, her face is going to become a white blob, mainly because the rest of the stage is so much darker in contrast. So spot metering allows you to put a small spot on a small location, a person's face, and take the light reading from that face and use that to expose the picture. Now, newer cameras have taken this technology a step further, and they actually have a face priority spotlight setting. And so what this is telling the camera is, I need the faces in this image to be exposed correctly, and forget the rest of the image, just get the faces right. And this is really useful for this exact kind of scenario where you have dancers on a spotlit stage. And it would be even better if it was actually reliable. I find that most of these other metering modes ultimately aren't reliable enough. They get it wrong. So my strategy with metering is pretty simple. I use the main multimetering or evaluative matrix, whatever you want to call it, and that introduces something called exposure compensation. So I look at my image, I check my histogram, and I decide whether this is properly exposed or not. And if I think the image is too bright, then I can use my exposure compensation to make it darker. If I think it's too dark, I can use exposure compensation to make it brighter. Now, of course, if the shot is a one-off, if this is something that's happening in a hurry, this is not practical. But in most circumstances, a dark bear grazing along a stream bed, I can take a picture, check my histogram, and adjust the settings accordingly, as long as I'm quick about it, and as long as I'm at least reasonably close. And I find it's far quicker for me to adjust my exposure compensation than it is for me to change my metering mode. So ultimately, my strategy for getting exposures right is use what is generally the best exposure metering mode system, and then just adjust as necessary with exposure compensation.